So anyway, welcome to Rough Cut Faith. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Rough Cut Faith. Guys, taking you behind the scenes, this is the second time that we are having this conversation. The first time, I'm going to blame it on technical difficulties. So we have started the Advent series. And Mike, you did a really bang-up job.
Thank you.
In establishing a baseline and a foundation for the rest of the conversations that are going to follow. For those of you that watch Rough Cut, if you didn't see the sermon or haven't caught it or what have you, the last conversation that was had was the beginning of the foundations of belonging, and it was belonging to God. And bringing out that idea of this relationship of love that we respond to, and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that was a great peg to stick to start the conversation, because in this time there's so much that calls our attention, or this is a time where I think it elicits a lot of that conversation of what does it mean to have a sense of belonging? What does it mean at this time to feel like you have a place to belong in the first place? And so starting the conversation of belonging to God in the illustration that that you used was like a family picture. And I know that for many people, that illustration of family can be hard to try and retrofit into a place of faith and all of that, because oftentimes we will transpose the baggage that we have with family onto the family of God, or onto God, or those kinds of things. But it's still important to hear that baseline of where we're at in that relationship as we move forward in the season.
Well, I think just to maybe make a bit of a separation with what I talked about, in talking about belonging with God and belonging to God as two separate concepts. And so we started with our initial, as humanity, our initial place, our initial state of being was with God, that there was communion with God, and then our wills, because the story of the fall of humanity, the story of the fall into sin was our will separated from God's will, humanity's will separated from God's will, and in that separation, death means separation from God, and so there is this separation that happened, but that was not supposed to be our original state. So we belong with God in communion with Him, but then we also, in following Christ, as Christ made a way for us to be with God again, then we come into a state of belonging to God. And so we use the example of bird cages. Like if somebody, if a bird belongs to a person, it's just in this maybe a really nice cage, but it's hanging there. There's no freedom to it. So the contrast of that, we don't belong to God like a bird in a gilded cage. We belong to God like a child belongs to a parent, within a family structure, within a structure that is safe and secure and loving and affectionate.
So can I toss something out here for consideration as we really start to kick the tires on this concept and unpack all of this? I think even for the folks that don't realize it, that wouldn't necessarily say this openly, there's an undercurrent in the human experience that is a desire to feel like we belong, someplace, that we feel connected someplace, even for people like Mike, who is incredibly introverted and would rather not be around people. Still
Not
that
antisocial.
Wow. Mike just doesn't like folks at all. This explains why he's been distant from me.
that's a deeper conversation. But yeah, I think, and I think that's part of why this season can be so hard and challenging, because it draws so much of it to the surface. And I would argue that even I think so much of this gets hung on the peg of Christmas.
Yeah.
But really, we're starting this in November.
Yeah.
This starts with Thanksgiving and the holiday season, which commercially starts earlier in August. Yeah.
July.
Like, so it's this constant reminder, if you are coming into this season with baggage and hardship, that, like, man, I really wish that I felt like I had connection and belonged someplace.
Sure. Yeah, and even I think we mentioned it, maybe in some of the other conversations that we've had, but even for those who have experienced loss,
Yeah.
like that sense of belonging isn't, I wish I had somewhere to belong. It's, I had a place and someone died, or someone moved away, and my sense of belonging went away with them.
Yeah.
I can think of multiple people that the holiday season is painful, and the thought of decorating even for Christmas is just too much, because it is that reminder of their sense of belonging no longer. The people that made their sense of belonging a reality are gone. And so it's just too much.
Yeah.
And often it takes people years until they get back to a spot where they can go, I'm ready again. You know,
Yeah.
that healing process when you lose a sense of belonging is, boy, I tell you, it's a lot more complicated than we'd like to think. You know,
I think a lot of this is way more complicated than we like to think when you unpack this whole everything. So the entire path of leading up to Christmas and then walking out of Christmas, and what is life post December 25th, and how do all of these things fit in, and all of that kind of stuff. I think some of the individual concepts that are covered are not earth-shattering. They're not new information. Like the conversation that you had yesterday, the dialogue that you had, it wasn't like you uncovered this heavily guarded secret or anything else like that. However, once you plug what you talked about into the paradigm of the holiday season, what does it mean to feel like I belong someplace? What does it mean to feel like there's any sense of connection, whether you don't know what that looks like, or you've tasted and seen, and that has been ripped away from you at a relational level? That's where that becomes incredibly profound and a really big deal. But in order for that to be incredibly profound and a really big deal, you need to be willing to enter into that honest dialogue and conversation and that vulnerability with God and all of those kinds of things. And that is a very challenging prospect.
Yeah, and I don't think we recognize how introspective it has to be.
Yeah.
Because we don't really think about a place of belonging. We don't, like, that's not the language that we use. You know, we'll use language like I'm restless or homesick or I don't have meaning. I don't have a purpose for my life. I don't have, like, all of these things that we don't have. We don't really think of it in terms of I don't belong somewhere.
Yeah, we'll say like I feel like an outsider,
Yeah,
or things
yeah,
like that, where it's like
Yeah.
it's easier to describe a sense of not belonging
Yeah.
sometimes than it is to actually say,
Yeah.
this is how I like. Yeah, this is what it feels like to be where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
You know?
yeah. That's why we defined it at the beginning.
Yeah.
Belonging is when you are where you are meant to be.
Yeah.
And I think that, like you said, it's nothing groundbreaking.
Right.
But it puts us all on the same page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It allows us all to say, oh, okay, like puzzle pieces going together. Like that makes sense when I am where I'm supposed to be. But then, like you're all like just jumping off what you're saying, there's the depth to that
Right.
of, oh, wait a minute, where am I supposed to be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is my sense of belonging just this thing that makes me feel good?
Yeah.
Is it this thing that makes me feel comfortable?
Yeah.
Well, what is that? And what is it based on my emotional state then? Is
Yeah.
it based on my accomplishments? Is it based on my relationships? What is it actually based on? So how do I determine and define where I'm supposed to be?
Yeah, that's really important, because if it's tied too tightly to our emotional state, then that's a risky way of defining a sense
Yeah.
of belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because even in my own life, as emotionally stable as I am, that's up and down.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So the dynamic of finding your belonging that's not rooted in an emotional, foundation
Yeah, yeah.
is really important for us, especially as the people of God.
Yeah.
You know.
And the challenging prospect, and this kind of brings in where you're going this week,
Sure.
is when, again, every layer of this, it builds off of the foundation of belonging to God, and then in addition to that, it's belonging to a community, and what that looks like, and you add that puzzle piece into it, and all of that kind of stuff, and when you're talking about the relational components of feeling like you belong someplace, and like this is a spot that you're supposed to be, which I think even that, I think we need to get away from trying to read into that some language of predestination
Yeah.
or anything else like that. It's just a place where you are connected, a place where there are certain things that humans were made for, even if we don't like it, even if it feels like we shouldn't connect or be connected. We are made for that. There is science to back that. That there is scripture to back that. But most of us can probably sit on the same page of pointing to a source of, well, I have a very complicated history of my experience with community or feeling like I belong to a group, and it becomes increasingly easier to live out of a place of guardedness because of what's happened,
Sure.
or allow for certain things to influence
Yeah.
how we move forward in engaging with other people.
Yeah, I think that's the role of vulnerability in our sense of belonging, because for those who have complicated stories of being a part of a community, which I think is being a part of a community authentically. If you've been a part of a community and there hasn't been conflict, or there haven't been places where there's like, oh, that hurts, like that's a part of what it means to be living honestly together. That's a part of what it means to be entering into the depths of being real.
Yeah.
Without vulnerability, we end up becoming a group of people just kind of doing something in the same space, rather than being people that are being shaped together toward that end of who we were made to be all along, and living into what it means to belong with God and to be with God together.
So I wholeheartedly agree with you. but how do we teach people, or how do we guide people
Sure.
into allowing vulnerability?
Sure.
Because I would say that, like, we think community is great and is
Yeah.
important, and
Yeah.
that's where you live out the Christian faith. That's how you show the love of God to each other, is in community.
Sure.
That's also where all the hurt happens.
Yeah. Yep.
There's no abuse without community.
Yeah.
You know, there's no pain without a community causing the pain, or someone in that community
Yeah.
causing pain. So the double-edged sword of community is, we need it, but it has also, for most people, been the source of trauma
Yeah.
and pain. So how then do we help people? I'm not thinking about the people about us who need to be vulnerable within
Yeah.
community. How do we help the community allow for vulnerability and not
Sure.
become a greater source of pain in that vulnerability?
Yeah. You look like you got something. Go ahead.
Yeah, so
I have my thoughts.
there are, it's a couple-fold. You know, the go-to answer that you can grab right off the shelf is, meet vulnerability with vulnerability. Allow for yourself to express these woundings, these experiences, these realities in a way that shows that you're human too. But I think the other portion of it that seems like it should go without saying, but I think evidenced by how often this doesn't happen, it absolutely does need to be said, that we need to be able to create a safe space for folks to be able to express themselves and be honestly who they are, inviting the messiness. Because if you allow somebody to be authentically who they are, that automatically, because we're humans, because because of who and what we are, will invite in messiness. And I think there's oftentimes an unfortunate disconnect when you get to the point of wanting to elicit the response of vulnerability. But when somebody is vulnerable and talks about those things, or says something that you disagree with, or comes at it from a different angle or something like that, there's this spirit of, I need to correct you. I need to step in and say something, rather than responding out of a place of just hearing them. Just being present in that exact moment. And I think all of us have our blind spots to this. You know what I mean? Like, I'm gonna throw some haymakers here real quick, guys. So I'll take the heat for everybody. If anybody else wants to say anything out of pocket, I'll get out of pocket first and take it for everybody. It's easier for me to love on somebody who doesn't look the same as me, or somebody who chooses their pronoun or identifies as whatever, or that neighborhood, than it is for me to love on somebody who comes forward in the Christian faith and starts spouting off dogma or incorrect information or different things like that, because my instinct is to be like, yo, Ashbed, you're gonna lead people astray with bad teaching and all of that. So just being honest about that's my version, my go-to version of struggling with this. So it's not like, oh, because I'm saying this is I've got this all perfected or whatever. But I really think that if we are going to expect for people or desire for people to come forward and to bear themselves and to say, look, this, I'll put it in the context of the season. This season sucks, and I want to disconnect, and I want to run, and I hate Christmas and all of this kind of stuff. And that can go for any time of year. It doesn't matter, spring, summer, fall, winter, it doesn't matter. But for this season, then we need to be willing to hear the war wounds and to actually listen rather than listen till the point of being able to give a response. If you can speak into a conversation and speak into a situation, that's different than listening to waiting for you to be able to give your response.
Sure. Well, I was just listening so I could give my opinion too.
Yep.
So,
As you do.
yeah, I think in what you guys have said, the one piece that may be a little different is how do we help people learn how to be vulnerable? And like in one sense, Joe, what I heard you saying is is like the extremes of it's easier for me to be vulnerable. Sorry, hang on a second. I'm not emotional. I just have something in my throat. It's easier to go like here's the extremes of where it's easy for me to listen and engage with somebody vulnerably in like where they're at. But the reality I think for most of us is we often sit around people that are just like us. And it becomes more complicated with somebody just like us to be nurturing vulnerability because then you're pulling down a layer. And so how do we help people do that? I keep in my head as you guys were talking, I just kept going back to like, how did Jesus do this? Well, he lived and walked with his disciples.
Yeah.
He showed them this is the way that we do it. I'm like, oh, okay, so there is a sense of how do we teach the church to be vulnerable and enter into it? We model it as pastors. That's unique for me and for the guys around this table in that, okay, we serve in pastoral roles. People look to us for spiritual guidance. So the first layer is it has to be modeled. That's terrifying because it's like, oh, wait, okay, so if I'm not modeling this well, if I'm not modeling this, or if all I ever do is just bring my garbage out and just be like, look at what a mess my life is, you know?
Which is not, I
Go ahead.
want to just break in there.
Sure.
That's not necessarily vulnerability.
You're right.
Exactly.
It's,
Yes.
Vulnerability is not just saying, here's all the mess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but there is a sense of, okay, model this. And then I started thinking about like Paul and some of his letters, and he's like, don't you remember the way we lived among you? Like, don't you remember what it was like for us to follow Jesus in your presence? And I go, it has to be modeled.
Yeah.
And so much of what it means to help the community of God, to help the followers of God to be vulnerable is a commitment to model it to each other.
Yeah.
We've got to have leaders that model it for everyone, and there is a commitment. The amount of times where, and I think this speaks to what you were saying, Joe, in the sense of if you're just waiting to fix somebody's vulnerability,
Yeah.
then you're not really entering into it.
Yeah.
You're in some ways it's that sense of saying, because I said so just be quiet and don't make me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think that I think you just hit like the nail on the head for one of these topics here is we don't like the uncomfortability, the discomfort. Uncomfortability isn't a word.
Sure.
We don't
It is
like
today.
today it is. We don't like the discomfort of vulnerability that we see in others.
Sure.
So in order to, I feel like I think people want to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
It
Or at
feels
least to be known.
Yeah, because of that, because you can't be known without being vulnerable. So I think the desire, and it goes back to our belonging, we desire to belong, to be in the place where we were meant to be. Well, that means being vulnerable. That means being known. But one of the barriers to vulnerability isn't that people don't want to be vulnerable. It's that the response to vulnerability is discomfort.
Yep.
And so that stops us, you know, and the sense then that we need to fix it and make it better. The one group that we have here, the formation group, that's been going for about a year. At one point, we had a few meetings, and the whole premise of the group is what do you see God doing in your life? How have you experienced the presence of God in this last month? And a lot of times, it's difficulty. It's the things that we are struggling with that we've seen the presence of God in.
Sure.
And after a few months of that, it kind of became like there were a few people that were really uncomfortable with whenever someone starts to open up, get emotional or vulnerable, they jump in and like start to give advice, start to like fix it. And I remember after one meeting together, I got an email the next day from somebody in the group saying, please remind everyone that this is not a group counseling session. Just remind everyone that it's okay to let this sit, and just because that's what it's about. It's about just opening up, speaking what's happening, and sometimes it's just like, well, that sucks. I really wish that didn't happen to you, but we're in it with you, and okay, next person.
I in Rhythms for the December newsletter, I talked about if you want to live with a sense of belonging in your life, it means you have to be somewhere where you're both fully known or deeply known and fully loved. And if one of those is missing, then you're not really able to experience the potential of belonging. Because if we are not deeply known, then you find yourself in a spot where it's more likely that you'll go, well, if I actually tell someone what I think, or if I actually tell someone how I really feel, will they still care about me? Will they still love me? And that's, you'll never really experience true vulnerability in that sense, because you're always holding something back. And so you never really get to experience the depth of what God intended for us as his community. Now, I'm not saying that you live vulnerably with everyone.
No.
I am saying that there should be people who know you deeply and who also love you completely, even with all of your failures and faults. And those are the people that, when you do have those conversations about where you're at, if there is certain habits or patterns of your life that are unhealthy, there's a relational context for them to go, hey, have you considered this? Have you, like, there's enough relationship there that it allows you to speak into each other's well-being. But there's also enough relationship where if you're just bleeding on the inside, that you can just go, this is where I'm at. And they're not going to fix you. They're just going to love you right there. They're going to pray for you. They're going to be committed to, is there anything I can do to help lighten your burden in this season? And that's not necessarily advice. Sometimes that's just their presence.
Presence is so critical. That was, I'm glad you said that, because that was the word that kept coming to mind. That I don't think we allow the space for presence. Too many words crowds out presence. And if you feel, we talk about being a safe person or having safe people in our lives. That's something that, for my family, we've spent a lot of time talking about who are safe people and how can we be safe people for others. And I think that that presence is the safe. That's one of the ways to describe a safe person, that they can be present with you, which means they're not distracted by other things. They're not jumping in and correcting you when you are vulnerable. They're just being present and trying to listen and trying to hear what's being said, trying to see the heart behind what's going on. And a person who's present is also just willing to exist, to be, and not fix, and not try to calm everything down. And they're okay in the discomfort.
I think all three of us are saying very, very similar things. So I would maybe argue that the only difference that what you said would bring to it is just hitting it from a different angle. Largely saying, though, the same kind of thesis statement.
Sure.
Is, I mean, I would argue that you don't need to teach people how to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
You need to create an environment where they can be.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm not necessarily. I'm not sure that what I said was extreme versions of it. I think I think you can take those very same concepts and transplant them into, well, what does it look like if I'm sitting with somebody who would wrestle with the same things that I would wrestle with, and or somebody who would wrestle differently and be quicker to call out something that I wouldn't be, and all of those kinds of things. And I think when it comes to establishing a baseline of vulnerability and openness for folks, I worry that sometimes something like saying we need to model it can become ambiguous enough for folks that it just kind of becomes fodder for noise in the background.
Sure.
Like, we need to model vulnerability. Okay, I haven't ever been given a context where I can be vulnerable and have it be safe, so I don't know how to model that in other people. So I'm going to do this version that I think is vulnerability and model that. And this seems like it's a good idea.
Yeah.
And then you're teaching that to other people and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think in what we have talked about in the descriptions of, like, one, listening, being a good listener, being present, all of those things are characteristics of creating a space where people can experience vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think uniquely as a pastor, people will look to us in the settings where they interact with us, whether that's a small group here at the church, or a small group conversation, or the way we engage with each other. Like, we're showing people, hey, listen, this is how you think, where you're not necessarily, this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
To live alongside of other people. I had somebody made a comment to me the other day about one of the groups that I facilitated, where they said, I'm learning to listen more because of how I've watched you lead the group by listening, which is weird for me because I talk all the time. But
you do listen. Like,
I try.
You do. You're a talkative person, but you do listen well. And I don't think that one negates the other.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but that would be an example in my mind of somebody saying, "Oh, I've seen the way that you are in a room with a group of people, and like you come back to people that are asking questions or sharing things about what's going on, and ask clarifying questions and engage with them in a way that draws them into the conversation more." And this person said, "I really am trying to work on that because I've seen what it looks like now, how to do that well." And so, so I think in that sense, that's what I mean by modeling. It's not so much I think, yes, you're right. We have to give some practical examples for people, because if you're listening to this and you're not in a context where that happens anywhere, then you're like, well, that sounds good, but I don't know what it looks like.
Yeah.
Right.
I can look at a manual about how to do work on my bike or on my motorcycle or something like that, but it's completely different to sit down and watch a YouTube video.
Yeah. Yeah.
And see it and be like, oh, that's that. Like, you can have the cognitive understanding of, okay, I've got to take this part off, I got to clean this part, I got to do this, okay, and still feel like I don't even have an example of it, right?
Yeah.
But then to sit down and watch a video of somebody that's done well, where they're explaining it and then they're showing you, they're going through it, like, that's where I'm like, oh, I mean, that's what Jesus did with the disciples. That's what I get the impression Paul was doing in the churches that he started with the leaders. That's his interaction with Timothy, and Titus. He's a, hey, remember these things, remember this, remember how I did this with you, and watch out for that. And so I think that's where, for me, when I consider how do we create a space of vulnerability, when I say model, that's what I mean. And I don't mean like extreme as like, everybody has different contexts of people that we engage with. And so that's not, that I wasn't just being like, oh, but I think sometimes folks that are just paying attention here, maybe your context is not the context they're going to interact with. And that's what I was meaning by it,
Well, I think it's kind of like if you raise a kid, or any kid, if you're around kids,
Yeah.
they mimic behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry, Amy.
it doesn't matter what you tell them.
Yeah.
They will do what they see being done.
Yeah.
And so I think that the culture, when it comes to a church culture,
Yeah.
the culture of a church is it's a trickle down culture from leadership.
Right.
And I wish it wasn't, because there's so much weakness in leaders. But you can't get away from it. It doesn't matter the size of the church or a denomination or even a group. Like, don't even think about a faith community, but just a group with a leader. The leader is going to set some sort of tone in that group, and the people will mimic behavior in some regard.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you have to be the model of safety, the model of presence, the model of vulnerability. But you're right. It's not good enough to just say model it in a context where someone might just be listening to this.
Yeah.
But I think as leadership, it is incumbent upon leaders to model the safe space and the presence that they want the group to be. Because it's not good enough if you just tell them to do it.
This might be a different conversation for a different day. How then do we as leaders, or do people as leaders, help correct unhelpful patterns or actions while still also teaching and explaining vulnerability?
Within what context?
I don't know. I'm just like if we're sitting here and we're saying like, okay, well, you got to be able to listen, right? But let's say you see somebody that they're just blatantly doing something that's clearly undermining or destructive towards someone.
Right. Yeah.
How do you make that distinction in vulnerability? Because often that's one of the places where leadership gets really uncomfortable, is when you see destructive patterns that you have to confront, and then like, how do you not allow confrontation of destructive behavior to become like, oh, that's the norm in the place where you've tried to create vulnerability?
Well, I think that
Maybe that's a bad question.
I think it's a
good
really
question.
good question, and I think it is a bigger conversation. But as a response to that, I think that if you can approach it as a leader, if you can approach that particular situation as a guardian of the safe space, so you're a protector of this place that is safe. We're trying to create safe space here, safe people here, and if there's destructive patterns that are affecting the community, then the job of the leadership is to go, that's not safe. Like, this is the antithesis of what we're trying to do. And sometimes people will be responsive to that and go, oh, I didn't even realize this was a pattern. I didn't even realize that this was going on. Thanks for bringing that up. That's often also requires some sort of relational context to do that. But on the flip side of it, there's anger. There's a defensive response.
Sure.
And so I think a safe leader and a vulnerable leader will say, that hurts.
Yeah.
Like what you're doing right now is the pattern. What you're doing right now is not safe.
Yeah.
Right.
And it really hurts me to have to confront with this, but we want everyone to experience and know the love of God here, and not the judgment and condemnation, the condemnation of others. So I do think that I think you can approach it as a protector, and anyone could do that.
Go ahead.
So, and just to add to what Mike said, people will know if it is an inclusive desire for everyone to feel safe and for it to be a safe place for everyone. And if, as the guardian, you are approaching it from a position of being adversarial against the person who is disrupting the safety of the group, that will be conveyed.
Yeah. Yeah.
That will
Yeah.
put that person
Yeah.
on a back foot and be more likely to elicit those kinds of responses of negativity, anger, separation, all of those kinds of things. Ultimately, you can say and do all of the right things, and
Somebody
the
still can
person
respond.
can
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
cheese it and be done.
Yeah.
But that, I think more like that was if this is an emergency situation, one
Yeah.
that requires an immediate response,
Sure.
phenomenal.
Yeah.
If it's an undercurrent,
Yeah.
I think it's the very same thing that you were talking about before. In a context where you can sit down and be vulnerable
Yeah.
with that person,
Yeah.
start to ask questions.
Yeah.
Start to put like, okay, so this happened, and
Yeah.
you can address it in a way of being upfront about this. But okay, so why did this happen?
Yeah.
Why did you go there? Why
Leading
did
with
this?
curiosity as opposed to confrontation. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think as I've listened to this, and maybe it's just like I hear like different phrases. I think what I would say is what we're trying to create is emotionally healthy spaces.
Yeah.
And relationally healthy dynamics.
Yeah.
Because safety matters. None of us want to be in an unsafe environment. Yet, I think that there are probably some folks that'll hear the word safe spaces and they'll be like, why would people have to deal with uncomfortable things? I'm like, yeah, sure, absolutely. But we can still do that in an emotionally healthy way and in a relationally healthy way.
Yep.
And so maybe the dynamic is what is it about the way we belong to a community that makes it a healthy thing for us, a healthy experience for us, where we can be known and be loved. And what are the patterns that we as the people of God need to adopt that we have observed from God himself, the character of God himself, to then bring that into the community of God and say, these are the values, these are the principles that together we are committed to. And that may mean sometimes it's uncomfortable for us.
Yeah.
But ultimately to know that there is a commitment to each other, that we want God's best for each other. And so we lean into that. And we do that with patience. We do that with appropriate vulnerability. We do that with appropriate honesty. And at times, in places where it's not an emergency situation where you've got to step in, right? Because that's an extreme. That's not what most of us experience most of the time. So I want to be careful to not go there because that's kind of what I was saying.
Yeah.
Like, but in ways that we lead with the curiosity so that we don't put up unnecessary barriers right away.
Yeah.
But ask the questions and seek understanding, because often what happens is, instead of being curious and saying, hey, you said this, even when it comes to theological issues, hey, you said this, I disagree with that. And so it turns into this point where instead of saying, this is what you said and this is who you are now because you said it, be like, hey, I think I heard you said this from what I heard or what I'm understanding. How does this is my perception of what I've always expected something to be. So how, can you bring some clarity because I'm confused now? What do you actually think? Where are you at? Because that then invites the further conversation that allows the community to not be necessarily unnecessarily torn apart, but instead to be able to continue to grow and deepen a sense of trust with each other. And I mean, we've seen that happen in positive ways here. We've seen that happen in ways that are painful. And it's just, and so what is it though that as a community we are creating healthy spaces for each other to be known and be loved?
Yeah.
That's good. And I want to take the moment to counsel anybody who may have heard all of this for the last stretch of time and, said, not me, right? I don't need this.
Yeah.
If you guys would humor me for a second to bring in a non-Christian centric example
Sure.
of how I have seen it evidenced that people will come together under a common idea of just having a place to go. In college, there was a group of us that would not that didn't have a place to go. We didn't have family, anything like that, and so
Around the holidays?
Around the holidays,
Okay.
yeah. And so we started this thing where it was just us as friends at first. Of we'd go out to dinner and to a movie because those are the things that are open on Christmas, and so and then it became like if you have no place to go, join us. Come join us. People ended up coming that we had never seen before.
Yeah.
It just was an idea of having a place to go, and so. That is an example of this desire for belonging that we talk about. And so if you're hearing all of this and you're saying, I don't need that, or I've experienced too much to really engage there, let me just take my word for it, guys, because you should always trust a guy on the internet. If I can be sitting here, I promise you still have hope for being able to engage relationally. I'll just leave that there. But the reality is, guys, that whether you do this well or not, you're still going to find yourself seeking to belong someplace. And so for those of us that are aware of that, for those of us that are aware of our surroundings and have the ability to be able to cultivate community spaces where folks can be safe and all of that, that's why it's so important for us to extend that. And for those that are still trying to work their way through that, just understand that you are not alone in that desire and in that wrestling and all of that kind of stuff. And that there are spaces that can be safe, even though you likely, if you're listening to this and you fall into that category, have experienced exactly not that.
Yeah.
So,
Don't
guys,
give up hope.
yeah, don't give up hope. Guys, I appreciate your time.
Yep.
Glad we could do this.
time.
And if you have any questions about what we've talked about, drop a comment. Let us know. We invite, encourage the conversation. That it gives us a better idea of when we come on here, and we talk about these things. We don't really. It's hard for us to drill into exactly where folks may be struggling or what questions folks may have with some of the things that we bring up on here. And so please understand that all of us welcome the dialogue. And if you are a part of the in-person community, there is also, you can still leave a comment and all of that, but come talk to us. Come have a conversation with us. Hey, I heard you say this during Rough Cut. And could you unpack that? We also have the Q&Rs after the services. For questions that you have about the Christian faith or about the sermon or stuff like that. Just the opportunity is there to engage and have dialogue. So don't be afraid to do as such. But guys, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah. Awesome.